Welcome to this episode of Today on Wall Street. We're so great to have you here. So, Mr. Myllyvirta, you are the lead analyst at CREA, Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air. Before we get started, can you please introduce yourself to our audience a little bit? What brought you to research on clean energy and what interests you the most about China?
What we do at CREA is to try and promote clean air and clean energy by through research, evidence, modeling, and other tools that can help people working for clean air and clean energy in different countries. Obviously, as the largest energy consumer in the world and the largest carbon dioxide emitter, China is one of the focuses for our work.
Right. And speaking of China and the focus on clean energy, as you know, this week around 120 world leaders are attending the COP26 climate talks in Glasgow, which earlier this year, if I recall, Ambassador John Kerry described as our last and best chance on climate. So for our non-expert audience, can you please explain the consequences of failing to limit global warming to less than 1.5 Celsius a little bit? Why is it imperative to reach a net zero or close to net zero emissions by the mid of the century?
Right. So a lot of the ecosystems that we all depend on around the world, including major food production systems, including forests, coral reefs, and so on, are highly vulnerable to a fast increase in emissions. So the concern is that for many countries around the world, crucial things like food supply will be compromised if global temperatures increase more than 1.5 degrees. And that includes China, where the water resources and agriculture are vulnerable. And of course, what happens in one country doesn't stay in one country. So if some countries in the world destabilize or become unsuitable for example, agriculture, that will have implications for all of our security and stability.
Right. Well, thank you for that introduction, which makes this all the more concerning that Xi Jinping is skipping this year's COP26 meeting in person. Meanwhile, domestically, China is currently suffering from the worst power shortages in over a decade, which really puts Beijing in a tough situation heading into the climate conference this and next week. So can you please tell us a little more about the root causes of the current power crunch in China? So we saw multiple narratives in the media. Do you think these narratives are false or misleading? What's the actual reason for the power shortage China is currently experiencing?
The most fundamental reason that there have been power shortages and even power cuts is that in China, up to very recently, the electricity prices paid to coal-fired power plants were still regulated, while the coal prices for coal, the fuel, were determined on the market. And so when coal prices increased, but electricity prices were not increased in tandem, it became unprofitable for many coal-fired power plants to keep purchasing coal and to keep producing electricity. And then in September, when coal prices rose to a very high level, a lot of power plants simply went offline, stopped producing. They reported that they're having a maintenance outage or whatnot. The other factors that contributed to the crisis are that China's coal demand, coal consumption increased very rapidly after the COVID-19 lockdowns, because the economic recovery was very heavily driven by construction and heavy industry, which consumes a lot of coal and a lot of electricity. The other factor was that there were quite a few supply disruptions, some of them due to, for example, heavy rains, others related to government campaigns on corruption and on mine safety that reduced coal production.
I see. Well, thank you for that introduction. So, the reasons are really clear as we can tell from your introduction. But why is it so hard for China to break from its decades-old addiction to coal, so to speak? Why is it so hard to get rid of that habit?
China is the world's largest investor in wind and solar and nuclear, the key electricity generation technologies that can help replace coal in power generation. However, in the past 5 years, and especially after the COVID-19 lockdowns, electricity consumption increased very fast, and even those world-leading investments weren't large enough. So what is needed now is for investments in wind and solar and nuclear to approximately double or triple from the current levels, so that all the increase in electricity demand can be covered from those clean sources, and then on top of that, they can start to replace existing generation from coal. And the other change that is needed is to change the pattern of economic growth, so that it's not driven as much by construction and by real estate, which are very highly energy intensive. And of course, those are challenging changes to implement because there are strong interests behind the coal industry and behind those construction-related industries in China. So that's the dilemma that the policymakers are obviously grappling with.
Right. So speaking of challenges, as we remember, in September, President Xi Jinping actually made a promise to the world that China is going to stop funding coal-fired power projects worldwide. At that time, that promise really won Beijing international praise and encouragement. But China's emission cutting plan submitted to the UN last week was more or less perceived as a disappointment to world leaders. They have been pressuring Beijing to make a significant improvement in its pledges and to speed up its plans to decarbonize its economy. But as we saw, given the current energy crisis and also China's delicate domestic politics leading up to the Party Congress next year, are there reasons for us to be hopeful on China achieving its goals on time, or do you think there are more things that should concern us?
The big announcement that Xi Jinping made over a year ago of China targeting carbon neutrality was, of course, an extremely important positive step. And now, when it's more than a year has passed, and there has been a lot of policy making happening in China around that target, other countries and a lot of Chinese observers were expecting a more detailed plan that would answer some of those remaining questions, like how fast, how much will emissions still rise before their peak, and how fast will emissions start to fall after they peak. The target is for emissions to peak before 2030, but those two crucial questions are still unanswered. I would say that the fact that that coal prices and fossil fuel prices are extremely high at the moment is per se a good thing for clean energy. Of course, it makes energy sources that don't rely on coal and gas much more attractive and profitable. I think what happened with the CO2 peaking action plan that was just published is that because of what's happening in China, the coal crises and the real estate slowdown, the future outlook for the next years in terms of emissions is very uncertain. And so that's why policymakers were not prepared to come up with the kind of detailed plan that we were expecting. But it doesn't mean that emissions will rise more. Both of those factors, the high fossil fuel prices and the real estate slowdown, in fact, mean that the emissions are rising much more slowly or even falling at the moment.
I see. So from Chinese policymakers' perspective, I wonder if there's a better way to balance those two objectives, China's climate promise or climate goals and its economic growth. What's the optimal path to balance those two priorities?
I would argue that there's, in fact, an opportunity for those two to go together. If you look at the economic goals that China has, that the Chinese leadership has set, that include high quality economic growth, that include reducing reliance on the kind of fictional or low quality growth stemming from real estate speculation and so on, those goals will make it a lot easier for CO2 emissions to peak and decline, because they mean that growth will have to come from less energy intensive and less carbon intensive sectors of the economy, including private consumption, including high-tech industries, including service industries. And so those two goals can really complement each other.
I see. Well, thank you for the introduction and all the insights. Final question of the day. As we just learned this morning, President Xi Jinping is not going to attend the conference in person or via a video link. Instead, he's going to submit a written statement to the conference. So in the absence of China or Xi Jinping's participation, what's your expectation of the outcome of this year's climate conference? What's the best scenario? What's the worst scenario? Do you think it's going to be a disappointment? Do you think there's going to be anything substantial that comes out of it?
The climate summits are mainly events where countries go to present their homework. So over the past 2 years, countries have set new targets, come up with new plans, and all of that is presented in Glasgow. And the presence of heads of state and so on is more an opportunity for different countries to comment on each other's pledges and commitments and have a bit of a battle of words over who is doing well, who is not doing enough. So I think what I would call a good outcome out of Glasgow is more noting the progress that has happened over the past couple of years and then making it clear that it's still not enough, that stronger targets and pledges will be needed. And a part of that is having a stronger path and stronger targets for China for this decade. So I don't think it's crucial for Xi Jinping to be there. He hasn't traveled abroad at all since the COVID-19 pandemic. So I wouldn't read anything into the fact that he's not traveling. Mm-hmm. But I think a good outcome from Glasgow would be simply setting up a process to close the gap between the emission policies and targets that we need to have in place to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees and the pledges that are in place at the moment.
I see. Thank you so much for all the insights. This is such a helpful conversation. Thank you so much, Mr. Myllyvirta, and I look forward to talking to you in the future. Have a good rest of the day, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
感谢您来到由我李琦 Lizzi 为您带来的今日华尔街频道。在看过节目之后，如果喜欢，请别忘了为节目点赞，也请您在留言区留下您对节目的见解和意见。如果您是频道会员的话，我们会在第一时间回复您的留言，解答您的疑问。另外，如果还没有订阅的话，请记得要订阅频道，并且打开订阅按钮旁边的小铃铛，这样您就可以在第一时间收到节目发布的最新信息了。再次感谢您观看今日华尔街频道，我是李琦，我们下次再会。